The Garden of Second Chances. Chapter 1: New Soil. The moving truck pulled away from 42 Maple Lane at exactly 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, leaving behind 43 years of memories and Margaret Holloway standing alone on the sidewalk of Willowbrook Retirement Community. At 71, she had never lived anywhere that required a key card to enter her own building, and the plastic rectangle felt foreign between her fingers as she approached the glass doors. Mrs. Holloway, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a clipboard, appeared beside her. "I'm Janet, the community coordinator. Ready to see your new home?" Margaret nodded, though ready felt like an overstatement. 6 months ago, she'd been tending her prize-winning roses in the backyard of the house where she'd raised 3 children and buried 1 husband. Now David's voice echoed in her memory from their last conversation. "Mom, you can't keep pretending everything's fine. You fell twice last month, and Mrs. Peterson is worried sick about you being alone in that big house." The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt eternal. Margaret caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. Silver hair that had once been auburn, brown eyes that held decades of laughter lines, and clothes that seemed to hang differently on her smaller frame since Robert's death 2 years ago. "Here we are, 3B, Janet chirped, sliding the key card with practiced efficiency. The door opened to reveal a 1-bedroom apartment flooded with afternoon sunlight. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a courtyard where residents sat at picnic tables, some playing cards, others simply watching the world go by. "The moving company said they'd have everything in place by 4, Janet continued. "Your son David called this morning to confirm your internet installation for tomorrow. He seemed very concerned about making sure you could video chat with your grandchildren." Margaret smiled despite herself. David meant well, even if his concern sometimes felt suffocating. "He thinks I'm helpless with technology. Last week he tried to teach me how to use his smartphone for 20 minutes before I reminded him I've been using a computer for my genealogy research longer than he's been married." Janet laughed. "Adult children can be challenging at any age. My mother lives here too, Unit 2A, and my brother still calls me to ask if I'm keeping an eye on her, as if she hasn't been perfectly capable of keeping an eye on herself for 78 years. The apartment slowly revealed its potential as Margaret walked through it. The kitchen was smaller than she was used to, but the appliances were new and the countertops granite. The bedroom would fit her antique dresser and the reading chair Robert had given her for their 30th anniversary. Most importantly, the living room had space for her piano. "There's a music room downstairs," Janet mentioned, following Margaret's gaze to where the piano would sit. "Some residents prefer to practice there, especially if they're still learning." "I've been playing for 65 years, Margaret said mildly. "I think my neighbors will survive some Chopin at reasonable hours." After Janet left, Margaret sat in her one piece of furniture, the reading chair the movers had placed by the window, and surveyed her new domain. Boxes labeled kitchen, bedroom, and Robert's office in David's careful handwriting surrounded her like cardboard monuments to a life in transition. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter Susan in Portland. "How's the new place, Mom? Call me when you're settled." Then another from her youngest, Michael, in Chicago. "Dad would be proud of you for making this move. Love you." Margaret typed back responses, then deleted them without sending. What could she say? That she felt like she was visiting someone else's life? That she missed the creaking floorboard outside her bedroom, and the way the kitchen faucet dripped just enough to be noticeable but not enough to be truly annoying? Instead, she opened the first box. 3 hours later, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her dishes in their new cupboards and family photographs arranged on the mantel, Margaret began to see possibilities. The apartment felt less like a consolation prize and more like a fresh chapter. She was unpacking her recipe box when someone knocked. Through the peephole, she saw a woman about her age holding a casserole dish and wearing a smile that seemed genuine rather than dutiful. "I'm Eleanor Chun from 3D, the woman said when Margaret opened the door. I brought dinner. Moving day calories don't count, but cooking on your first night in a new place should be illegal. Eleanor was petite and elegant, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that crinkled with humor. She wore a simple blue sweater and practical flats, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. That's very kind, Margaret said, accepting the warm dish. I was just debating between unpacking my pots and calling for pizza. Pizza's fine for college students. We're sophisticated women who deserve better. May I? Eleanor gestured toward the apartment, and Margaret stepped aside to let her in. This is lovely, Eleanor said, taking in Margaret's initial arrangements. You have excellent taste. And is that a piano? It will be, once the movers bring it tomorrow. Do you play? Eleanor's face lit up. Not well, but enthusiastically. I've been looking for someone to play duets with. There are a few musicians here, but most of them prefer that modern jazz nonsense. Give me a good waltz any day. Margaret found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time since she'd agreed to move. I couldn't agree more. Though I have to admit, my grandson has been trying to teach me to appreciate hip-hop. How's that going? I'm still waiting to appreciate it. They talked easily while Margaret finished unpacking her kitchen, Eleanor helping to arrange items in the most practical places. It felt natural, like reconnecting with an old friend rather than meeting a stranger. So what's your story? Margaret asked as they sat down to Eleanor's excellent chicken and rice casserole. How long have you been here? 3 years in January. My husband passed. Heart attack while he was fixing the garbage disposal of all things. And my children decided I shouldn't live alone anymore. Eleanor's tone held no bitterness, just matter-of-fact acceptance. They weren't wrong. The house felt enormous without Paul, and I was spending too much time talking to the television. I understand that feeling. What about you? Widow. 2 years now. Robert had cancer. We knew it was coming, which was both a blessing and a curse. Time to say goodbye, but also time to watch him disappear piece by piece. Eleanor reached across the small table and squeezed Margaret's hand. The hardest part isn't the dying. It's learning to live differently afterward. Margaret felt tears threaten for the first time all day, not from sadness but from recognition. Here was someone who understood without explanation, without platitudes about Robert being in a better place or everything happening for a reason. The weird thing, Margaret said, is that I thought I'd grieve then move on. Instead, I'm grieving and moving on at the same time. Some days I feel guilty for being excited about something, and other days I feel guilty for being sad. That sounds about right. Paul used to make fun of my soap operas. Last month I discovered I actually liked The Bachelor. I felt like I was betraying him by enjoying something he would have hated. Then I realized he probably would have started watching with me, just to make sarcastic comments. They talked until nearly 10 o'clock, long after the casserole was finished and Margaret's coffee had gone cold. Eleanor was a retired librarian who had raised 2 daughters, survived breast cancer at 55, and learned to salsa dance at 68 because Paul had always been too shy to take lessons with her. The thing about this place, Eleanor said as she prepared to leave, is that it can be whatever you make it. Some people come here to wait. Others come here to start over. Which are you planning to be? Margaret considered the question as she walked Eleanor to the door. I honestly don't know yet. That's a good answer. The ones who are sure usually haven't thought it through. After Eleanor left, Margaret finished unpacking her bedroom and hung Robert's favorite tie on the closet door where she could see it, but where it wouldn't dominate the space. She arranged her medications in the bathroom cabinet. Nothing dramatic, just blood pressure pills and calcium supplements, and plugged in her phone charger. Before bed, she video called her granddaughter Emma, who was 16 and possessed the particular kind of patience teenagers reserved for grandparents they genuinely loved. Grandma, how's your new place? Dad said it's like a hotel. Margaret adjusted the tablet David had insisted she needed, trying to get the angle right. "It's nice, sweetheart. Smaller than the old house, but everything works and I met a lovely neighbor. Are you going to make friends? Dad's worried you'll just stay in your room and read all day. Your father worries about everything." "Yes, I'm going to make friends. And there's nothing wrong with reading all day occasionally." Emma grinned. "Can I come visit? Mom said maybe during Christmas break." "I'd love that. There's a shopping center within walking distance, and I'll need someone to help me figure out which stores are worth visiting." They chatted about Emma's upcoming driver's test and her boyfriend troubles until Margaret's eyes grew heavy. After they hung up, she sat in the reading chair and looked out at the courtyard, now lit by decorative lamps and mostly empty except for one man walking a small dog. Tomorrow there would be more unpacking, more adjustments, more conversations with well-meaning family members, asking how she was settling in. But tonight, for the first time since Robert's diagnosis, Margaret felt something she had forgotten she was capable of feeling: curiosity about what came next. Chapter 2: Growing Season. The piano arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, followed immediately by a phone call from David. "Mom, I'm sorry I couldn't be there for the delivery, but I want to make sure they put it in the right place. Did you measure? Because if it doesn't fit, we can." David breathed. Margaret watched through her window as two men maneuvered her beloved Steinway baby grand off the truck with the kind of professional care that cost extra but was worth every penny. "It's going to fit perfectly. But if it doesn't, then I'll have them move it. I've been making decisions about furniture placement since before you were born." A pause. "I know, Mom. I worry." "I know you do, sweetheart. But I need you to worry a little less and trust a little more." After she hung up, Margaret watched the movers navigate the piano through the lobby with Eleanor providing unnecessary but enthusiastic commentary from the sidelines. By 9:30, the instrument sat in the spot Margaret had selected, its familiar wood grain catching the morning light. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, running her fingers along the closed keyboard cover. "Paul always wanted a piano, but we never had the space. Or the money, if I'm being honest." Margaret opened the cover and played a simple scale, listening to how the notes filled her new space. The acoustics were different here, brighter with more echo, but the sound was still true. "Would you like to try?" she offered, sliding over on the bench. Eleanor looked thrilled and terrified in equal measure. "I haven't played in years. I took lessons as a child, but my mother said I had no talent and should focus on more practical skills." "Mothers aren't always right about everything," Margaret said gently. "Try this." She placed Eleanor's right hand on the keys and taught her a simple melody. Mary Had a Little Lamb in a more sophisticated arrangement than the children's version. Eleanor's fingers were stiff at first, but muscle memory began to return as she repeated the phrases. "I can't believe I remember this," Eleanor laughed, stumbling through the final notes. "It's like riding a bicycle, except you look more foolish when you fall off." They spent the morning exploring the piano together, with Margaret reacquainting herself with the instrument and Eleanor rediscovering a part of herself she'd forgotten existed. Around 11, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find a man in his early 70s wearing paint-stained clothes and holding a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Grandpa." "I'm Frank Romano from down the hall," he said. "I came to complain about the noise, but that was some pretty nice noise. Chopin. Mostly. Some Beethoven." "I'm Margaret, and this is Eleanor." Frank nodded approvingly. "My late wife loved classical music. Used to drag me to symphony concerts where I'd fall asleep in the first movement and snore through the second. But I learned to appreciate it eventually. Mind if I ask what that last piece was?" "For Elise," Eleanor answered. "Margaret was showing me how to play the opening." "Ah, Helen's favorite. She tried to learn it on our old upright, but arthritis got in the way." Frank's expression grew wistful. "Would you mind playing it again?" I promise I won't fall asleep this time." Margaret and Eleanor exchanged glances. "Would you like to come in?" Margaret offered. Frank hesitated. "I don't want to impose. I was actually heading down to work in the community garden. We're getting the last of the tomatoes in before the frost." "There's a garden?" Margaret's interest was immediate and obvious. "Oh yes," Eleanor said. "Several residents maintain plots. Frank grows the most amazing vegetables." "It's just a hobby," Frank said modestly, but his pride was evident. "Something to keep my hands busy." "You interested in gardening?" Margaret thought of her rose garden, the careful cultivation of 30 years reduced to detailed notes she'd left for the new owners of her house. "I used to grow roses. Won several local competitions, actually." Frank's face lit up. "No kidding. We've got space for ornamental plants too. Most folks stick to vegetables, but there's a whole section that's been begging for someone with an eye for flowers." "Could I see it?" "Absolutely. Eleanor, you coming?" The three of them took the elevator down to the main floor, Frank chattering about soil conditions and seasonal plantings with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his retirement passion. The community garden was accessible through the dining room and larger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 2 acres of neatly organized plots behind the main building. "We get full sun most of the day," Frank explained, leading them along gravel paths between raised beds. "The soil was terrible when I first got here, but we've been adding compost for 3 years now. It's rich enough to grow anything." Margaret surveyed the space with the gardener's critical eye. Most of the plots were winding down for the season, but she could see evidence of careful planning and genuine skill. Tomato plants heavy with late fruit, rows of lettuce and spinach taking advantage of the cooler weather, herbs that were still producing despite the October chill. "This is impressive," she said. "How many people participate?" "About 15 regularly, maybe 20 occasionally. We share tools, trade produce, help each other with problems. It's become quite a little community within the community." Eleanor bent to examine a patch of marigolds that were still blooming bright orange and yellow. "I tried to grow flowers once. Everything died." "That's because you treated plants like books," Frank said with gentle teasing. "You can't just put them on a shelf and expect them to thrive without attention. Books don't require watering." "True, but they also don't reward you with tomatoes." Margaret walked to the far end of the garden, where Frank had mentioned the ornamental section. It was currently empty except for some struggling mums that had clearly been planted without much thought to design or care. But the location was perfect, visible from the main building's common areas, with good drainage and protection from the strongest winds. "What would you think about roses here?" she asked Frank. "Not a huge garden, but maybe a showcase bed? Something the whole community could enjoy." Frank's eyes lit up. "That would be fantastic. We've talked about adding more decorative elements, but none of us really know how to design that kind of thing. You'd be willing to take that on?" Margaret felt a familiar excitement building in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when she'd first seen her old backyard and envisioned what it could become. "I'd love to. When would be the best time to start planning?" "Now, actually. Fall is perfect for planning and soil preparation. Spring planting, but if you want to do it right, the prep work starts now." They spent another hour in the garden, Frank showing off his prized beefsteak tomatoes and Margaret sketching rough ideas for the rose bed on the back of an old envelope. Eleanor mostly listened, but Margaret noticed she paid attention to everything, asking thoughtful questions about timing and design. "I should let you get back to your unpacking," Frank finally said, checking his watch. "But if you're serious about the roses, I'd be happy to help with the heavy work. I've got more time than I know what to do with, and my back is still good for digging." "I'm very serious," Margaret assured him, "and I'd appreciate the help." As they walked back toward the building, Eleanor linked her arm through Margaret's. "You're glowing," she observed. "I haven't seen you look this excited since you started talking about moving here." I haven't felt this excited, Margaret admitted. I thought I'd left gardening behind with the house. It never occurred to me I could start over here. That seems to be the theme of your new life. That afternoon, Margaret called her local garden center to ask about fall bulb planting and rose varieties that would thrive in their climate zone. The familiar rhythm of research and planning felt like coming home to herself. She made lists of potential plants, sketched garden layouts, and looked up companion planting guides on her laptop. David called at 5, as he had every day since she'd moved. How was your second day, Mom? Wonderful, actually. I met some neighbors, and there's a community garden where I'm going to plant roses. That's great. Are you sure you should be taking on a big project right away? You're still adjusting and physical work. David. Margaret kept her voice patient but firm. I'm not adjusting to being an invalid. I'm adjusting to a new home where I can pursue interests I'd forgotten I had. I know, but… No buts. I'm happy. Isn't that what you wanted when you suggested I move here? A long pause. Yes, of course. I just don't want you to overdo it. I promise to pace myself. And I have help. There's a lovely man named Frank who knows all about gardening, and Eleanor, my new friend, is interested in learning. You sound different, David said finally. More. I don't know. More like yourself. Margaret smiled, looking out at the garden where Frank was still working, harvesting the last of his summer crop. I feel more like myself. Maybe a new version of myself, but still me. That evening, she video called Michael in Chicago and found herself talking enthusiastically about soil pH and bloom schedules. Her youngest son listened with the kind of patient attention that reminded her why he'd always been her easiest child. Dad would love this, Michael said when she finished describing her plans. Remember how proud he was of your roses? He used to brag about your awards to anyone who'd listen. He did, didn't he? Margaret felt the familiar bittersweet pang of missing Robert, but it was gentler now, mixed with gratitude for the memories rather than dominated by loss. I think he'd be happy about this move too. He always worried about me being alone in the house. He'd be proud of how brave you're being. I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm finally doing something that makes sense. After they hung up, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table with graph paper and colored pencils, designing her rose garden by lamplight. The apartment was quiet around her, but it was a comfortable quiet rather than the hollow silence she'd grown used to in her old house. Through the window, she could see lights in other apartments, glimpses of her new neighbors settling into their evening routines. Tomorrow she would call the garden center, price out plants and supplies, maybe drive to the library to research the latest rose varieties. She had projects to plan and friends to make and stories to discover. For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret went to bed excited about tomorrow. Chapter 3: Deep Roots. The Willowbrook Community Center buzzed with the controlled chaos of the monthly residents' meeting. Margaret arrived early, claiming a seat in the third row next to Eleanor, who was furiously scribbling notes for her presentation on the proposed book club expansion. Nervous? Margaret asked, noticing her friend's white knuckles around her pen. Terrified, Eleanor admitted. I've run library board meetings for 20 years, but somehow this feels more intimidating. Margaret understood. In the 3 weeks since she'd arrived at Willowbrook, she'd begun to see the complex social dynamics that governed any community of strong-willed, accomplished people learning to live in proximity. Tonight she would present her rose garden proposal to the grounds committee, and despite Frank's encouragement, she felt her own flutter of nerves. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started, called Harold Winters, the Residents Association president. At 78, Harold ran meetings with the precision of someone who had spent decades managing corporate boardrooms. First item: Eleanor Chun with an update on library services. Eleanor took the podium with visible composure, transforming from nervous friend to confident librarian, as she outlined her plans to expand the community library beyond its current collection of donated mysteries and outdated magazines. Research shows that intellectual engagement is crucial for cognitive health in our demographic, she said, consulting her notes. I'm proposing we establish partnerships with the county library system, create a budget for new acquisitions, and organize discussion groups around current bestsellers as well as classics. What would this cost? Asked Dorothy Brennan, the community's self-appointed fiscal watchdog. Eleanor had clearly anticipated this question. Initial setup would be approximately $2,000 for new books and organization systems. Annual maintenance would run about $800, which we could potentially offset through small fundraising activities. The room erupted in the kind of spirited debate Margaret was learning to expect from any gathering of retired professionals. Teachers, executives, engineers, and social workers who had spent decades making decisions and solving problems didn't become passive just because they'd moved to a retirement community. I think it's an excellent idea, offered James Patterson, a retired English professor. Though I'd suggest we include more contemporary works. Some of us are interested in understanding the world our grandchildren are inheriting. As long as we don't abandon the classics, added Marion Wells. There's value in shared cultural literacy. Margaret found herself oddly moved by the passionate discussion. These were people who cared deeply about ideas, who saw books not as mere entertainment, but as tools for continued growth and connection. The debate continued for 20 minutes before Harold called for a preliminary vote. Eleanor's proposal passed with overwhelming support, pending a detailed budget review. Congratulations, Margaret whispered as Eleanor returned to her seat, flushed with success. Next item, Harold announced. Margaret Holloway with a proposal for the grounds committee. Margaret's mouth went dry as she walked to the front of the room. Through the large windows, she could see the community garden where Frank was probably still working despite the gathering dusk. I'd like to propose a rose garden in the ornamental section of our community garden, she began, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Something that would provide year-round beauty for the entire community and could become a source of pride for Willowbrook. She outlined her vision. A formal rose bed with varieties chosen for extended bloom time, disease resistance, and visual impact. Pathways that would allow residents with mobility issues to enjoy the garden up close. Benches where people could sit and read or visit. A small memorial area where residents could plant roses in honor of loved ones. The initial cost would be approximately $1,500 for plants, soil amendments, and basic infrastructure, she continued, consulting the notes she'd spent hours preparing. Ongoing maintenance would be minimal since roses, once established, are quite self-sufficient. Dorothy Brennan raised her hand. Who would maintain this garden? What happens if you become unable to care for it? It was a reasonable question, but Margaret heard the underlying assumption that at 71 she was already 1 foot in the grave. I've been gardening for 45 years, Margaret replied calmly. My roses have won 7 regional competitions. I understand the long-term commitment involved, and I'm prepared to make it. Additionally, Frank Romano has offered to assist, and I'm hoping to train other interested residents in basic rose care. But what if, Dorothy persisted. Dorothy, interrupted Frank from the back of the room. What if the sun doesn't come up tomorrow? What if the building falls down? We can't plan for every possible disaster. Margaret knows what she's doing, and the community would benefit. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for his support, but she needed to answer the question herself. Mrs. Brennan raises a valid concern, she acknowledged. None of us knows what the future holds, but that's exactly why I want to do this now while I can. If something happens to me 5 years from now, at least the community will have 5 years of beauty to remember. And hopefully by then, others will have learned enough to carry on. The room fell quiet. Margaret looked around at faces that reflected her own awareness of mortality, her own determination to make the most of whatever time remained. I'd also like to suggest, she continued, that this could become an ongoing memorial garden. When residents pass away, their families could contribute to planting new roses in their memory. It would give us a way to honor our friends and keep something beautiful growing in their name. Margaret saw Eleanor dab at her eyes with a tissue. Harold cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. Even Dorothy looked thoughtful. Any other questions? Harold asked. James Patterson raised his hand. Would you consider making this an educational project? I know several residents who would be interested in learning about gardening. This could become a teaching garden as well as a memorial space. Margaret hadn't considered that possibility, but it felt right immediately. I'd love that. We could have workshops on pruning, pest management, seasonal care. Make it a learning opportunity for anyone interested. The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, Margaret found herself surrounded by residents offering congratulations and asking questions about timing, plant varieties, and volunteer opportunities. The energy was infectious, transforming her private dream into a community vision. You did beautifully, Eleanor said as the crowd thinned. I was so nervous about my little book club proposal, and you just got up there and inspired an entire room. I surprised myself, Margaret admitted, but it felt important to be clear about why this matters. Frank approached, still carrying his world's okayest grandpa mug. Ready to start planning the real work? Because now that everyone's excited, we need to figure out how to make it happen. They spent the next hour in the community room, sketching layouts on napkins and discussing seasonal timelines. Other residents drifted over to contribute ideas. Someone knew a wholesale supplier for bulk soil amendments. Another had connections to a landscaping company that might donate labor for the initial bed preparation. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the generosity and enthusiasm. In her old neighborhood, she had been friendly with her neighbors but hadn't truly known most of them. Here, people were investing in each other's dreams as well as their own. We should celebrate, Eleanor suggested as they finally prepared to leave. This calls for wine. It's nearly 10 o'clock, Margaret protested. All the more reason for wine. They ended up in Eleanor's apartment, which was decorated in soothing blues and greens with photographs from what were clearly extensive travels. Eleanor poured 3 glasses of a surprisingly good Pinot Grigio, while Frank examined her bookshelves. You've been everywhere, he observed, studying a photo of Eleanor standing in front of the Taj Mahal. Paul and I traveled whenever we could afford it, Eleanor explained. It was our one extravagance. Every year we'd pick somewhere new and save up for the trip. Where was your favorite place? Margaret asked, settling into Eleanor's comfortable sofa. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Probably Tuscany. We went for our 25th anniversary and ended up extending the trip by a week because we couldn't bear to leave. The food, the wine, the way everyone took time to really live instead of just rushing through life. Helen and I always talked about traveling, Frank said wistfully. But there was always something. The kids' college expenses, home repairs, her mother's health issues. We kept saying we'd do it when we retired. And then she died 2 months after my retirement party. I'm sorry, Margaret said softly. The funny thing is, I could still travel now. I've got the time and the money. But it doesn't seem right to go to the places we planned to see together without her. Eleanor refilled his wine glass. Maybe it's not about going to the places you plan together. Maybe it's about going to new places and having experiences she'd want you to have. You think Helen would want me to travel alone? I think Helen would want you to be happy. And if traveling would make you happy, then yes. Margaret listened to this exchange with the fascination of someone discovering how other people navigated widowhood. Robert had been gone 2 years, but she still found herself avoiding restaurants they'd enjoyed together, skipping movies he would have wanted to see. What about you, Margaret? Frank asked. Any travel dreams? Robert and I went to England once for our 30th anniversary. I loved the gardens, Sissinghurst, Hitcote, all the famous ones. I always wanted to go back and see more. Maybe take a garden tour of Scotland or Ireland. So why don't you? Eleanor challenged. Margaret started to explain all the reasons why she couldn't. The expense, the logistics of traveling alone, the uncertainty of her health, but stopped herself. Were those real obstacles, or was she simply afraid? I don't know, she said honestly. I hadn't really considered it an option. Everything's an option until you're dead, Frank said matter-of-factly. Helen used to tell me that when I'd make excuses about why we couldn't afford this or didn't have time for that. Turned out she was right, just not in the way we expected. They talked until nearly midnight. Three people who had lived full lives discovering they still had dreams to pursue. Margaret went to bed that night thinking not just about roses and garden design, but about passport renewals and travel insurance, and whether she was brave enough to explore the world by herself. The next morning brought a call from Susan in Portland. David told me about your garden project, Susan said. It sounds wonderful, Mom. Dad would be so proud. I hope so. I'm excited about it. He always said you had the most beautiful hands he'd ever seen, all dirty with soil and covered in scratches from thorns. He loved watching you work in the garden. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came with unexpected memories of Robert. But instead of the crushing sadness she'd grown accustomed to, she felt something lighter, gratitude that she had loved someone who appreciated her passions. I miss him, she said simply. I know, but I'm glad you're doing this. It sounds like you're really building a life there. I'm trying. It's different than I expected. Different how? Margaret considered the question. I thought retirement communities were places people went to wait. But everyone here is still becoming something. Eleanor's revolutionizing the library. Frank's teaching people to garden. Harold runs meetings like he's managing a Fortune 500 company. Nobody's given up. That's wonderful, Mom. You sound happier than you have in months. That afternoon, Margaret drove to her first garden center visit in over a year. She spent 2 hours consulting with the staff about rose varieties, seasonal planting schedules, and soil preparation techniques. She ordered 3 cubic yards of compost, a dozen heritage roses chosen for their disease resistance and extended bloom periods, and enough mulch to suppress weeds for the garden's first crucial season. The young man helping her load fertilizer into her car looked surprised when she mentioned the quantity of plants she was ordering. That's a pretty ambitious project, he said. You sure you don't want to start smaller? Margaret smiled, thinking of Dorothy Brennan's concerns and her own unexpected answer about making the most of whatever time she had left. At my age, she said, there's no point in thinking small. Chapter 4. Pruning season. The first frost of the season arrived on a Thursday morning in early November, coating the community garden in a delicate silver layer that transformed Frank's tired tomato plants into works of art. Margaret stood at her kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, watching the sun slowly melt the frost and reveal the ground where her rose garden would soon take root. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Grandma, Dad said you're starting a rose garden. Can you teach me about flowers when I visit at Christmas? Margaret smiled and typed back. Absolutely. We'll plan the whole garden together. The response came immediately. Yes. I'm researching roses online. Did you know there are over 150 species? Trust Emma to turn grandmother-granddaughter bonding into a research project. Margaret was still marveling at her granddaughter's enthusiasm when Eleanor knocked. Ready for our big adventure? Eleanor asked, holding up car keys and looking uncharacteristically nervous. Today was the day Eleanor had finally agreed to visit the community college's computer center to learn about online research databases. After her successful library proposal, she'd realized that her technological skills hadn't kept pace with modern library science, and she was determined to catch up. Are you sure you want me along? Margaret asked, grabbing her purse. This is your learning experience. I need moral support. And you're good with computers from all that genealogy research. If I panic and forget everything, you can translate. The community college was a 15-minute drive through neighborhoods Margaret was still learning to navigate. She'd lived in this town for less than 2 months, but already she was beginning to recognize landmarks and feel oriented in space. It was a different kind of belonging than what she'd experienced in her old neighborhood, where familiarity had been built over decades.